Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the PR Report. This is Pleb Rising with episode 11, going over the sovereign individual, mastering the transition to the information age. Chapter 11 is up for today. It's morality and crime in the natural economy of the information age. It's the last chapter of the book. And we'll do a quick run through. Start off with a quote, we believe that as the modern nation state decomposes, latter-day barbarians will increasingly come to exercise real power behind the scenes. They cite microparasites feeding on a dying system, employing techniques of the state but on a smaller scale, again due to this decentralized nature of the more efficient microprocessing-based technological advances. Microprocessing reduces the size needed of these groups in order to be effective in the use of and control of violence. Talk about the transition into the information age, giving way to predatory violence that's getting organized and becoming more decentralized, again, more efficient due to these technological advancements. Collapse in the existing system, that is only visible long after the infiltration of these, quote, barbarians in that official position, long since filled by self-serving, specific interest-serving individuals, not so much interested in the Constitution, but more so for themselves and their constituents, groups that they have an affinity with, and an end of an era usually experiences intense corruption. Quote, persistent make-believe. The mainstream media will not provide, or most likely will not provide, an accurate or timely understanding of the events unfolding, simply because it's hard to hear, hard to see, hard to notice, but also because there's a tendency to cling to the past, loyal to ideological commitments to socialism and the nation state, fear of repercussions perhaps for revealing truths. There might be fear of losing their jobs for reporting on these narratives that run counter to the prevailing consensus. These outlets could be corrupt themselves, and they will see little and explain less. Beyond reality, this notion of fabricated, artificially baked storytelling, order up customized new feeds tailored to one's whims and fantasies. They're mentioning that in the future, and this is something we've seen over the last couple of decades, is more and more user-specific content being presented to users based on their affinities. They're talking about in the information age, this could eventually give way to completely artificial and fabricated stories just to cater to one's whims and fantasies. And examples of how this could be occurring with respect to video, you could have artificial intelligence applied to video, resulting in deep fakes where scenes and visuals can be fabricated, different faces overlaid on other characters. You could also do that with audio to simulate voices. And you have a scenario or an environment where there's more information, but perhaps less understanding. So because of the information age, this transition into it, the proliferation of the internet economy, the information economy, the barriers to transmission of this information have fallen. So there's a lot more energy flying around. And in a sense, it's been liberated from political controls and time and place. So the value of judgment increases. Hard to do. So it gets harder and harder with all this increased information to be able to judge it and value it. With so much information, there's a premium put on brevity. So we ended up with all these small little news bites, perhaps dumbed down to get the most sensational impact on the reader. And that may or may not be a good thing. It might muddy the waters a little bit, make it hard to understand the central point that's being presented, if it's being presented at all. Quote from the book, rapidly changing technology is undermining the mega political basis of social and economic organization. As a consequence, broad paradigmatic understanding or unspoken theories about the way the world works are being antiquated more quickly than in the past. This increases the importance of the broad overview and diminishes the value of the individual, quote, facts of the kind that are readily available to almost anyone with an information retrieval system. People ignoring facts that don't fit their worldview or benefit them, described as tribalization or affinity groupification, existing in an echo chamber where you're walled off to opposing views, you're not open to having discourse or seeing other sides of the point because you're so wrapped up in your own viewpoint. Because of all these points, the authors describe the information age as yet having become the age of understanding. It might in the future. Another quote from the book: "The world now could know more than at any time in the past, but there is almost no public voice left to assess the meaning of the events and say what is true." And they have a passage that I extracted here that the central theme of this book has been, quote, "how changing technology and other mega political factors alter the natural economy." That goes in line, contrasts slightly with the theme of the book that they declared in chapter 1, which was the new revolution of power that is liberating individuals at the expense of the 20th century nation state. But here they're saying another central theme of the book is how changing technology and other mega political factors alter the natural economy. So what is the natural economy? Again, it's the Darwinian state of nature where outcomes are determined, sometimes unfairly, by physical force. And they emphasize the importance of a behavior described as interference competition, which actually is dug into in the next section. They talk about these competitors, quote, "gain and maintain control over resources by directly fighting off or hampering their rivals." This is contrasted with the, quote, "political economy," which is described or advertised as the rule of law or socially enforced rules of the game. But perhaps people only play by the rules when it suits them. And there's a follow-up. So this whole idea of gaining and maintaining control over resources by competition, they cite a paper that was actually published in a journal called nature.com, or Nature. The paper's titled "Species, Interaction, and Competition." It's a really interesting paper, but they highlight 3 main types of competition: interference, exploitation, and apparent. And I have a link, I'll put it in the description to follow up and read more on that. It's a pretty interesting topic. So this persistence of crime, war, and politics teaches us that actual human affairs still remain largely subject to the underlying pressures of natural economy. Economic outcomes are only partly determined by peaceful, law-abiding behaviors, honoring of property rights, and an assumption that others will not take what does not belong to them, but actually outcomes are just as much shaped by conflict and violence. Quote, "even under law and government, the rational, self-interested individual will strike a balance between lawful and unlawful means of acquiring resources, between production and exchange on the one hand, and theft, fraud, and extortion on the other." So then they talk about mugging in the information age and how now that we're in this scenario, we have all this information flying around. It's hard to judge. It's hard to understand what's going on, perhaps, although it might not be, depending on how one is able to think critically. And then you have this competitive environment of individuals, governments, groups fighting and competing over resources, that there's going to be an evolution in upsetting the balance of these power structures that are currently in place. So they point out again that because of this, this era where returns on violence are decreasing, that there's a falling decisiveness of military power. So the evidence for diminishing returns on violence, the declining decisiveness of centralized power, and the growth/rise of terrorism, organized crime, political corruption, and that weapons that employ microchips have tended to shift the balance of power towards the defense, making decisive aggression less profitable and therefore less likely. So this natural economy of the next millennium is looking good for small groups, tribes, gangs, gangsters, mafias, militias, solitary fringe type individuals. An example, this would be like the Unabomber. And this is what they were talking about up here with interference competition, where you have these competing groups coming together that are looking to gain a share of these resources. And that, again, ties back to the natural economy. And so these smaller groups in this era of diminishing returns on violence and a greater importance placed on efficiency, these smaller groups of like tribes, gangs, mafias, militias, solitary fringe types, they have an opportunity to have a real impact in that on that stage of interference, competition, and competing for resources. And talked about an information war ahead, again, pointing to the diminishing returns on violence. In the book, they use this term logic bombs as being able to potentially disrupt critical infrastructure. And this is just like hackers, hacking groups, hacking infrastructure, or weakly secured systems that society runs on. And again, this type of aggression, thanks to the decentralized nature of the technological advances, this type of aggression ascends locality. You don't have to be physically close to where the attacks are taking place. You simply have to gain access to those systems. They talk about the age of the sovereign individual, where the scale of warfare falls, defense and protection mounted at a smaller scale, which will make them, i.e. the defense and protection, will make them become more increasingly privatized goods and services, and provided on a for-profit basis, most likely by more and more by kind of private contractors, and that the privatization of policing was cited as an example. And they point out there's a rise in security guards, you have a rise in gated communities, you have security guards more at work and at schools and in shopping centers. And because the information technology has undermined the capacity of centralized authority to project power and provide physical security for systems that operate at a large scale, the optimal size of almost every enterprise in the, quote, natural economy is falling. So what they're saying there is basically because of this increase in efficiency that's happening with these microprocessing-based technological advances, it's going to favor smaller groups, decentralized groups, and more so than these centralized command and control structures. For most of the Industrial Revolution, serious wealth was made by bringing processes under one roof. Bigger was more efficient. Now that's not the case. Consider the definition of a racketeer as someone who creates a threat and then charges for its reduction. Government's provision of protection by this standard often qualifies as racketeering. Charles Tilly wrote that in a book called War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. I'll put that in the description. And again, another paraphrase from Tilly, the author cited was governments themselves are quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy that qualify as our largest examples of organized crime. So if a monopoly is breaking down, its competitors stand to benefit the most. So in this case, the large nation state, overbloated, inefficiency, centralized command and control structure historically, if that's breaking down, who's going to benefit the most? Its competitors. If we go back up here, who are its competitors? Going back to the conversation about natural economy in the next millennium, it's going to be these small groups, tribes, gangs, gangsters, mafias, militias, the solitary fringe types. They emphasize that moving forward, there's going to be more of a tendency for the existing system as it's on its way out, the large-scale nation-state systems, to be more corrupt, more infiltrated by organized crime, and individuals from that background seeping into government to serve their interests or interests of their group. In the end, they talk about how these smaller groups have historically been successful and cite several examples, but they point out that strong moral frameworks produce successful groups or nations or economies. They cited several small groups, Quakers, Mormons, etc., and they warned to steer clear of decadence after the rags to riches cycle is in play, where you start out with nothing, have a strong moral framework within your group, you rise up, experience success. There's a tendency to overindulge perhaps and fall by the wayside on what got you there. So that's surely a path to decline. Quote, "For human beings, it is a struggle rather than the achievement that matters. We are made for action, and the achievement can prove to be a great disappointment. The ambition, whatever it may be, sets the struggle in motion. But the struggle is more enjoyable than its own result, even when the objective is fully achieved." Now, somebody may or may not agree with this, but I think there is some truth to that. And in that, we set goals for ourselves. We have directions we're moving in throughout our lives. And oftentimes, the day-to-day experience of getting there is overlooked, but it's really the trials and tribulations and those day-to-day experiences we have on the way to achieving our goals that is where the real I think what they're saying here is where the real value of life is derived. Again, everybody has their own perspective on this, but it's not, I think what they're trying to say here is it's not so much the goal, because a lot of times when people get to that goal, they're not sure what to do, but it's the path or the journey of getting there or moving in that direction towards your goal. And this really ties into a main theme of individual that I've spent a lot of time consuming content from and learning from, and as he would say, getting insights and perspectives from. And this is a guy by the name of Joseph Rodriguez. And he speaks a lot about this, is enjoying the journey. You set your goals and you put your mind to it and know that they're going to happen, but don't lose sight of the fact of it's not just the goal that is the meaning, it's the continuous meaning through moments and the day-to-day actions that happen and how you react to everything on your journey towards that goal that is the real crux of the matter, or where like the real value from that process is derived. And then they talk about William James, American philosopher, driving this point home of action greater than being or just simply thinking. Those who tend to be more successful or get more out of life are those that take action rather than those that sit there and think in the comfort of their own minds. Thanks for listening.